So I would like to welcome you all to this webinar titled Stress Layering, Fault Slip and Hydraulic Fracture Propagation. The speaker of today's talk is Mr. Ankush Singh, whom I got to know from Partho Pratim Mandal. And I would like to thank Partho as well, who introduced me with Ankush. And I would also like to thank Ankush for agreeing to deliver this talk, which will, I suppose, greatly benefit our students in their future endeavors. So before we start, let me read his short biodata that he sent me a few days back. Ankush is a senior consulting engineer at Resfrac Corporation. I think it is based in California. Is it correct, Ankush?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. His work involves integrated concepts from geomechanics, geophysics, and reservoir engineering in solving field-scale problems related to subsurface energy. Ankush received his PhD in geophysics from Stanford University in 2021. His thesis was focused on predicting variations of stress with depth and analyzing its impact on hydraulic fracture propagation and fault slip. He utilized physics-based modeling and machine learning for geomechanical applications in unconventional enhanced geothermal system and induced seismicity. Ankush also received a master's degree in geology from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Ankush also worked as a geoscientist at Shell for 6 years at various international locations, including India, Russia, and New Zealand. His role was focused on performing geological modeling, uncertainty quantification, and value of information analysis for local oil and field gas fields. With this, I would like to invite Ankush to start with his talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mohit. I'm really happy to be presenting here. And I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll talk about this work, which was a part of my PhD, and it's pretty much related to what I do now in my current job as well. So now if from the presentation, if you remember only two things from the presentation, then what I want you to remember is that the stress in the Earth's crust can vary with depth, right? So it's when you drill into the Earth's crust or when you make observations at different depths, there's a lot of variation in the stress magnitudes, especially. But the good news is that this variation is coherent. It's not a random variation. And if you have the appropriate geological model, then you can predict these variations in stress. And that's something I'll talk about in more detail. And the second thing I want to emphasize is that a critical understanding of these stress variations and geomechanical modeling are essential for optimization of underground fluid injection operations. When I say underground fluid injection operations, it could range from anything related to hydraulic fracturing, enhanced geothermal systems, or long-term storage of CO2. So whenever you want to inject fluids underground, you should know the stress field and how it changes with depth in the earth if you want to execute and optimize the underground fluid injection operations. So I hope I'll be able to convey these 2 points from the presentation. So just in terms of why do we care so much about stress variations and geomechanics, just to give you a flavor, I'll just go through a couple of different applications that this research has. So one of the major applications that's up and coming, and something that I'm really excited about, is enhanced geothermal systems. And this is kind of the US Department of Energy's tagline, that with an enhanced geothermal reservoir, you can generate power anywhere with hot rock setup. So essentially, what is enhanced geothermal systems? For those of you who might be unfamiliar, in a traditional geothermal system, we drill into hot rock with high permeability. For example, the volcanic rocks in Iceland, for example, or in Indonesia, or in the Western US, where you drill and the fluid flows automatically. But there are a lot of other hot rocks. So essentially, in any place on Earth, if you drill deep enough, you will find hot rock. But most often, these don't have enough permeability for fluid flow. So what EGS tries to do is create that permeability. So in this EGS concept, we will drill long horizontal wells like the one you see on the blue over here, we'll create fractures, which may look like these, and these are very cartoon representations. And then as the water comes in contact with the hot rock, it gets heated up, converted to steam, and then we produce the steam through production wells. And then we can use this steam to produce power. And at the moment, EGS is pretty small, but there are, if you believe the optimistic estimates, then it could be about 10% of the US electricity market, and could be a pretty big thing globally, especially as it's a base load in the sense that it can provide energy 24/7. So it goes well with solar and wind, which are intermittent in nature. So it's good in combination to enable renewables. And in my work on enhanced geothermal systems was linked to this project called EGS CoLab project. So it's not a major part of this presentation, but it's a really interesting project. So I thought I'd just mention this. So in this project, what we did was, this is an abandoned gold mine. It was one of the largest gold mines in the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century. So now it's abandoned and used for different technical experiments. So in this abandoned well, we drilled a bunch of wells, and then we performed injection experiments at a 10-meter scale to try to understand on how the fluid flow happens within the rocks when you look at it from a close distance, which will not be possible on a field scale geothermal system. So the aim of this experiment was to find the connection between stress, seismicity, and permeability enhancement. So on how the fluid injection changes the stress in the rocks, on how it might cause induced seismicity, and how it increases the permeability of the rock. One good thing about the project is it's a publicly funded project and the data is publicly available. So for those of you who might be looking for a data set or for your thesis or for any research projects you're doing, there is a whole lot of data. It goes into hundreds of terabytes of different sorts of data is available if you're interested. So just putting this out there. The second application that I have also focused on and is part of my job right now as well is hydraulic fracturing in sedimentary rocks. So hydraulic fracturing in the US has just transformed the energy independence. So this graph shows you on how so the natural gas produced with hydraulic fracturing was increasing, but something happened around 2011 and then it just took off. So in this blue region, and this is one graphic that I find really interesting. So, so before about 2013-14, the US used to be an importer of LNG, liquefied natural gas. But now because of this hydraulic fracturing revolution, the US has become an LNG exporter from an LNG importer. So this has been the impact of hydraulic fracturing. And I also believe that globally, hydraulic fracturing could have a key role in decarbonization as well. So as a transition from coal to renewables, cheap, abundant natural gas can play a major role. And that's why hydraulic fracturing could be important everywhere else in the world as well, not just the US. So what has been done, which caused this sort of revolution, is we drilled long horizontal wells. So if you have your target layer with really low permeability, what used to be considered as source rock now is reservoir now. And in these horizontal wells, what we do is we isolate sections of these wells, which we call stages, and then we pump fluids at really high rates. And then we create fractures like this, which are usually vertical fractures. And then through these fractures, in these fractures, we also put in sand grains called proppant, and which kind of hold the fracture open when we are not pumping the fluid. So what happens is the hydrocarbons from the rock flow into the fractures and to the well, and then we are able to produce this, which we were not able to produce at any time in the past. So just to give you a flavor of what hydraulic fracturing is all about. But still, this hydraulic fracturing process is inefficient, and that's because of the lack of knowledge of subsurface geomechanics, which makes it hard to predict how high these fractures will go, for example, how large they'll grow, and a lot of these other things, which often result in a lot of unsuccessful wells. So that's what we're trying to understand when we analyze the geomechanics. And another thing that I use my research for is induced seismicity analysis. So this kind of shows the magnitude of 3+ earthquakes in the US through time. And if you notice that till 2010, in the central US, which is an intraplate region and should not be having natural earthquakes because of the plate boundaries out here in the West in California, we naturally had very low seismicity, and then suddenly the seismicity took off, and it has been established by a number of different researchers that a number of these earthquakes are due to fluid injection. So we do try to understand on what causes these earthquakes and how can we inject fluids to prevent these earthquakes. Most of them are very small earthquakes and not really harmful, but some of them could be potentially dangerous. So how do we have these earthquakes is when we inject fluid into the earth close to a fault. What happens is it increases the pore pressure in the fault and then can cause fault slip. So most of this is due to wastewater disposal. So when we produce hydrocarbons, we also produce a lot of water. Water has a lot of chemicals, so it needs to be disposed underground, and that underground disposal may cause earthquakes if it's close to a fault which is oriented for slip. And some of these earthquakes also happen in the process of the hydraulic fracturing itself. So if you're hydraulic fracturing close to a fault, then you can change the stress conditions around the fault and cause an earthquake. This is one of the major recent earthquakes sort of caused by fluid injection related to enhanced geothermal systems in Pohang, South Korea in 2019. These are pictures which shows how damaging the earthquake was about magnitude 5.5 in a city with 5 million people on the east coast of Korea. So when we try to sort of think about enhanced geothermal systems, hydraulic fracturing or CO2 storage underground, so the message is that we have to know the geomechanics well, otherwise these things can happen. So now, if you're convinced that it is useful to know the geomechanics, we'll go to the main part of the topic, which is the stress variations with depth. So before I go further, just so that we're on the same page, when I talk about stress, I talk about the three principal stresses. So in terms of the three principal stresses, if you have any point in the Earth's crust, the state of stress can be defined if you know the magnitude of the SH min, the SH max, and SV. And as the name suggests, the SV is the component of stress which is acting vertically. SH min and max are the horizontal components. The SV, the vertical stress, is very easy to find out because at any point it's simply the weight of the overlying rock at that particular point. So if we with just the rho GZ, we can easily calculate what the vertical stress is. SH min and SH max depend on a lot of tectonic factors, rock properties, and other things, and which is what we will focus on in the presentation. So depending on the relative magnitudes of these three principal stresses, we can be either in normal, strike slip, or reverse faulting regime. So if the vertical stress is highest, we are in a normal faulting regime. If the vertical stress is intermediate, we are in strike slip. If the vertical stress is least, we're in a reverse faulting regime. For all of our applications, we are mostly restricted to normal and strike slip faulting. Reason being, all of the reservoirs that we're targeting for all of these applications, you can safely assume that most of the time, except for a few exceptions, would be in a normal or strike slip faulting regime. So now, out of these, the most important is the SH min and the SH min magnitudes. And the reason being that if you know the SH min, we know the fluid pressure at which we can create a hydraulic fracture. So, and that's how we measure it. So when we pump fluid in the Earth's crust, you have, let's say at a fixed flow rate, so you have the pressure increases, you create a fracture, you keep flowing the fracture, and when you stop injecting the fluid, then the pressure reduces like this. So from this pressure curve, so and particularly the pressure at the when you shut in the flow, from that's how we measure the SH min in the subsurface. And if you know SH min, then you know at what pressure you create hydraulic fractures. Otherwise, you don't know. And why the reason why SH min is important is, as I mentioned before, SH min determines the hydraulic fracturing pressure. So when we inject the fluid, the hydraulic fracture grows in the SV SH max plane perpendicular to SH min, because as the name suggests, it's the smallest of the three principal stresses. And I have a few illustrations over here. So we had some case studies where the SH min was varying with depth. So we had different depth layers where the SH min sort of decreases as you go up. In this case, you have this layer where you have high SH min above and below the injection layer. And in this case as well, the SH min goes down and goes up with depth. So as you can see, when we inject the fluid in the same layer, depending on how these stresses are, the fracture looks really different. So what I'm plotting over here is fracture aperture in response to a fixed fluid injection. So in these cases, just because the SH min profiles are really different, you end up having really different looking fractures. And that's what I was talking about, that if we did not know this, we won't be able to predict whether a fracture will go up or down, which has implications both for the optimization and for the safety of the injection process. So that's why we want to know SH-min, right? And so a lot of my research has been focused on predicting this stress variations of the variation of SH-min with depth in sedimentary basins. And for this, we use a concept called viscoelastic stress relaxation that I'll briefly describe. So I'll kind of not burden you with any details over here, but just give you an overall flavor of what this is about. So how do we normally measure or how do we estimate SH-min? So we can measure SH-min at single points, but to know how the SH-min varies with depth, we have some certain constraints. So as I said before, the vertical stress is very easy. Just compute the weight of the overburden. We have a good estimate of usually of the density of the rocks, so we can easily find out what the vertical stress is. And then using this very well-known equation from Jaeger and Cook 1979 and Zoback 2007, we can estimate the minimum possible value for SH-min, which is called the frictional faulting equilibrium theory. Again, not going into details over here, but the theory is that if you had SH-min any lower than this, then any faults that you have will start to slip and increase the SH-min again. So this is kind of the natural lower bound for SH-min. So and if we go to igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, any of the hard brittle rocks, this equation predicts the SH-min quite well, and usually it will lie on this orange line. But when we have sedimentary rocks, things look really different. This is a very well-known example from a famous study in Colorado in the United States, where what the researchers did is that they measured the SH-min magnitude at different depths. And what they found is that the SH-min in sandstones, which is relatively more brittle, is lower and agrees with the frictional faulting equilibrium equation that I showed you in the previous slide, whereas SH-min in clay-rich shales is much higher than SH-min in sandstones. So this was kind of the observation over here. And then you have SH-min within the sandstones is related to pore pressure, as you would expect from the normal theory as well. So to explain this, a lot of work has been done in my research group from Professor Mark Zoback in Stanford University, and a number of students, including myself, have kind of worked on a similar topic. And what we've proposed is that this stress variation is due to creep or viscoelastic stress relaxation. So what is creep? Simply that if you take a block of rock and then you press it, if it's elastic, then if you keep the stress constant, your strain will change. For example, if you want to reduce the length of the block by applying stress, you need to apply more stress to reduce the length further. That's for a normal elastic medium. But for a viscoelastic medium, I can just apply some force, keep the force constant, and over time, I will see more strain. So the block will shorten over time, even if I don't apply additional stress, even at a constant stress. And thinking in an analogous way, if we have a constant strain boundary condition, an elastic rock will have, we will need constant stress to have constant strain. But for a viscoelastic medium, it's dependent on time over here. With time, you would need less stress to have the same strain. So in that sense, you can not increase the stress and increase the strain, or you can keep the strain constant and reduce the stress. So this is kind of to give you an overall idea of what viscoelastic stress relaxation is about. So using this theory, we hypothesize that in the shales, you have the stress is relaxing viscoelastically, and in the sandstones, the stress is not relaxing. So for those of you who are aware of Mohr circles, so in this sense, in the sandstones, you have the larger Mohr circle where the SH-min is much lower than the vertical stress, whereas in the shales, you have viscoelastic stress relaxation, which makes the Mohr circle smaller, and eventually for a fully relaxed medium, for example, something that is fluid, in that all the stresses would kind of equilibrate, and you would have an isotropic stress state, meaning that the vertical and horizontal stresses will all be the same in a hypothetical perfectly relaxed medium. So this theory is unique in the sense that it considers the impact of time-dependent deformation, which other theories for computing stress do not. and it's applicable for intraplate areas with low strain rate. And so it's, as I mentioned before, geological context is the key. This theory won't be applicable to plate boundaries, but for intraplate areas with very little tectonic deformation, this seems to work quite well. So using this theory, we've come up with this equation to compute the SH min as a function of the vertical stress and the time t, and there are some other constants over here. So I'll just not further bother with them for now. This is the strain, the overall strain that the rock has undergone through geological time. And we have two rock properties in this equation. That's the horizontal Young's modulus and the n. N is the parameter which is describing the time-dependent deformation. So we have one elastic term over here and one time-dependent term over here. So we've tried to predict SH min or with depth at different depths using this equation. And as long as we know the horizontal Young's modulus and this n term, we will be able to predict the SH min. And I'll show you a couple of quick case studies where we have done the exact same thing. So to predict this horizontal Young's modulus and this n term, traditionally what has been done is lab experiments. So in the lab, we do a creep experiment, which might last for a few days to a month. And then from the curves, you can estimate this horizontal Young's modulus and the n term. So in this case, this is the case study from that we worked on. So in this case, the company which had the well had done stress measurements at different depths in the well. So in these different geological formations, A, B, C, D, E, and F, we knew the stresses from before because of stress measurements. And just to give you an idea, this is very unique. So these stress measurements are really expensive, usually hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we normally have at most one stress measurement, if any. So this is kind of a really unique data set from that perspective. And some of my colleagues did creep experiments over there. So they had a constant stress and noticed the strain change. And from the shape of these curves, we are able to estimate these two parameters B, which is the inverse of the horizontal Young's modulus, and N, which is the time-dependent deformation. So using this, we were able, we tried to sort of predict we used to have a predicted stress and see how it compares to the measured stress value. We'll just go back to our equation over here. If we take a point for calibration, so for this point, we know the vertical stress, the SH min. From the creep experiments, we know the B and the N. So we use this point to calibrate the strain and the kappa constant. And using these constants, then we try to predict the stress corresponding to all the other stress measurements and see how they compare with the actual measurement. And the result turned out to be much better than we expected. So this is a calibration point, and we were able to predict the stress variations really well, that the stress increases from layers B to C to D to E, and the stress increases from layers B to A. The only layer where we could not predict was layer F, which was about 85 to 90% calcite. And we have some other things going on in the carbonates, which are more complicated. But in the clastic layers with high clay content, this method works really well. And just to compare, this is a method called the extended Eaton method, which is commonly used in the industry. Which at the moment you can see is not able to predict the actual stress values at all. And if you also have a look at the equation, you would want to apply this simple equation rather than this complicated extended Eaton equation. So that's the advantage of the viscoelastic stress relaxation method over what's currently used in the industry. Now the issue with this method is that we need to have a lot of stress measurements, and then we need to take core samples from all of these points, do creep experiments, which might last to a month. So it's all a really expensive and a long process, and the industry will not spend so much time and money on this. So the next case study was focused on trying to predict this from well-log data. So in terms of to use the well-log data for this prediction, we kind of modified the equations a little. As we were doing a statistical analysis term, again, I'm not going into details of the statistical analysis over here, but we changed all of these terms and converted it into a single parameter called n star epsilon t. And then we try to predict the n star epsilon t as a function of the well-log. So in this case, we know pretty much in all the cases what the vertical stress is. Horizontal Young's modulus is something we can routinely measure from the sonic log. It's a pretty common process. And so if you're able to predict this n star epsilon t as a function of the clay content, the calcite content, the quartz content, gamma ray, whatever logs we have available, then we will be able to predict the SH min as well. So again, luckily we had a data set where we had about 20 different stress measurements at different depths, and along with all the horizontal, along with all the well log measurements over here in a pilot well. And so using this equation, we did a statistical model, and we used bootstrap aggregation, commonly used technique for to get the most out of small data sets. So from a geomechanics perspective, this is a large data set, but from a machine learning, statistical learning point, this is a minuscule data set. So using that, we had to extract as much as we could from this data set. So the equation and the statistical model again worked pretty well. So these are the actual stress measurements that we have over here with the maroon dots, and the curves are predicted stress measurements. And as you can see, if we zoom in as well, they agree really well with the stress measurements. We can zoom in even further, and we've been able to predict these variations really well. And we had a R square of about 0.9, which is much better than what we expected before we started doing this project. Again, to make sure that we're not overfitting to the points from where we're modeling, we did a couple of blind tests. So in the blind tests, we took another well, which was about 20 kilometers away from our case study. And we just used the model without any recalibration, and we saw that we are able to predict these stress really well. So it just shows that the model is not just locally overfitting to our data set, but is kind of predicting a physical mechanism which can be applied to understand stress variations on a larger spatial scale. So that's kind of was a really good validation when you have a blind test being successful, and it takes away the concerns of overfitting to the small data set that we have. So far, what we've seen is I've kind of given you a flavor on using lab experiments to try to understand how the stress varies with depth in sedimentary basins, and also how we can do it using a statistical learning framework and well logs. I'll just finish off by showing you a couple of examples of kind of the fracture modeling we do once we have, like if we know the stress, how the stress varies with depth, how we use that to come up with the fracture model. So this is something I'd shown you before. So in this case, we have 3 different stress profiles. What we do over here is do a numerical model where we inject a fluid at a fixed point in the reservoir, and then because the SH min reduces in the layers above, what happens is that the hydraulic fracture goes up into those layers, and so you don't get any hydraulic fracture in the layer in which you actually were trying to inject the fluid. So that's very important, because you choose a layer to inject fluid because you want the hydraulic fracture to propagate within this layer. But since the stress is what we have, we'll end up with the hydraulic fracturing going up. Again, we have a similar situation over here, but in this case, the depths of these layers are different. So you still have the hydraulic fracture going up, but the aspect ratio of the hydraulic fractures look really different. And in reality, what any operator in unconventional hydrocarbon really wants is a situation like this, where you have high SH min layer above and high SH min layer below. So when you inject into your target layer, you have all of your hydraulic fracture propagation within the target layer. Something that I forgot to mention, the colors on this is the aperture. So when we propagate the fracture, I mentioned before that we inject some proppant grains, which are sand grains. And once the fracture closes because of the tectonic stresses, these sand grains keep the fracture open at local level. So what happens is within the fracture, because of the fluid flow, these sand grains get trapped in particular positions, and which is why you have specific parts of the fracture. And mostly you can see with the gravity, these are settling down. So bottom of the fracture, you have higher aperture, everywhere else you have a lower aperture. So this is kind of, what we do in terms of the fracture modeling. But in this case, we have a single fracture growing. So we inject at one place in a wellbore and we have this. When in reality, we would never do this. We would always have multiple fractures. So life becomes way more complex. So what happens is whenever you have a hydraulic fracture opening and growing, it changes the stress field right in its own neighborhood. So you can imagine when the hydraulic fracture opens, it compresses the rock formation close to it. So this kind of the fractures pushing everything away from it. And when you have multiple fractures growing together, you can have some weird looking fractures and shapes in the numerical model. And we've also observed this in data as well. And this is a talk in itself about the stress shadows. So this is what we can do is we can model that when a hydraulic fracture opens on how the stress in its vicinity changes as a function of the distance from the hydraulic fracture in the different layers. So again, not going into details, but something to be aware of, that the stress shadow is a really important thing. And this is, yeah, it's something that of the talk I give in itself in different geomechanics talks, but it's a really interesting topic, and don't want to take up too much of the time with it. And finally, to end, since the talk title also had fault slip in the title, so I'll give you an example of a fault slip analysis. So I just mentioned about the ETS Colab project before, and this is an example of the fault slip analysis and how we integrate it with the stress changes with depth. So for those of you who are aware of Mohr circles, this is a typical Mohr circle diagram that we use for fault slip analysis. If you're not aware of Mohr circles, no problem. So what we have is, in this case, we plot normal stress versus shear stress. And on the right, we have a stereo net. So we have a number of faults. So this is from an actual case study. So this is the orientation of all the different faults in red color or green color. And any fault of any orientation in a stress field has a normal and shear stress acting on it, and depending on how it's oriented with respect to the stress field. And when the normal and shear stress plot above these lines, which are called failure lines, then the fault will slip. When they are below these lines, the fault is stable. So in this case, all of these dots represent a fault, and where the plot on within this circle represents the ratio of the shear to normal stress acting on that particular fault. In this experiment, when we started, we had the pressure at the beginning of the experiment. As you can see, all of these fractures are below this failure line, so which means that none of them would experience any fault slip. We increase the pressure to hydrostatic, and again, all of these fractures are below this failure line, so nothing would happen. When we increase these fractures further to hydraulic fracturing pressure, you can see a number of these fractures are above this failure line, which means, and these are these red east-west fractures. So which means that in this case, these fractures would have shear slip. So you can imagine in the subsurface, you have faults in this configuration, and you have an initial fluid pressure where they're not slipping. But when you inject a lot of fluids, your failure line moves to the right, and then you have induced seismicity or fault slip, unintentional or intentional. So this is an example of how we do a fault slip analysis in the subsurface once we know the sort of the stress conditions in the geomechanics. So this is where we plot the vertical stress, the maximum horizontal stress SH max, minimum horizontal stress SH min. And again, this analysis can be done at a particular depth. And when you have stress variations with depth, we do it for each layer. So this is an example from the ETS Colab project where we took a number of different stress measurements, and we had a huge, so the x-axis is stress and y-axis is depth. And all of these points are stress measurements. So we had a number of these stress measurements which were varying with depth. Another interesting thing is, in this case, we had a rhyolite dike, which caused a lot of stress variations. Above the rhyolite dike, we had high stress. Below the rhyolite dike, we had again high SH min, but within the rhyolite, we had a very low SH min. So if you have a situation like this, we'll repeat the Mohr circle analysis at each depth. So for example, we can do a Mohr circle analysis for the upper zone, then for the middle zone, and for the lower zone. And what we observe over here, so in this plot, I plot the pore pressure which is needed to create shear slip with the depth. So for example, if I had a fracture in the rhyolite, I would need only 1000 psi of pressure to create an induced slip. Whereas if I had a fracture in the amphibolite, I would need 3000 psi of pressure. So it's much harder for an induced earthquake to occur in this zone than in this zone, for example. And that's how, if we have a real life situation, when we know the different zones and how much pore pressure is needed to slip over here, we can choose to sort of inject in the zone where we know there's less chance of an induced earthquake. So I hope that I've been able to convey that the stresses in the earth can vary with depth. You can predict these if you have the appropriate geological model in mind. And from the couple of examples that I've shown, I hope that I've been able to convey that an understanding of these stress variations with depth and geomechanical modeling are essential for optimization and safe execution of underground fluid injection operations. And this can be applied to hydraulic fracturing, long-term underground storage of CO2, and EGS systems, enhanced geothermal systems, which I'm really excited for in the future. And yeah, I think it's a prospect that's going to gain a lot of traction over 5 to 10 years. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ankush. It was a very nice presentation. So there are certainly some questions which people have posted in the chat box. So I would like to read those out for you. Okay.
For sure.
So the first question that someone asked, that is Getao Rang, which method is used for surveying to know where we can plant geothermal plant?
That's a good question. So for it, the answer in, as most answers in geology or geophysics are, that it depends. So if, let's say, if I was in an area like Iceland, for example, or the Western US, so often these areas are pretty well explored over there, and we know kind of, we have it mapped out through either seismic or gravitational measurements. And the most definitive way to know is to drill and to sample the fluid itself. So these are the traditional geothermal fields where we have like fluid flowing out. And a lot of cases, we also have hot springs on the surface. So they are a good indicator that you have heat and fluid flow down. For enhanced geothermal systems, it's a little different, as in we're not necessarily looking for fluid flow. What we're looking for is really hot rock where we can provide the fluid. So essentially any heat map of the area, and what you would trust the most is actual hard data in terms of drilling and temperature measurements at depth. You can get some overall idea from, let's say, from seismic, because normally heat zones are associated with fault zones and fluid flow and things like that. But for an actual decision making for where the hot rock is, so basically geological mapping and then drilling is the key. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is asked by Mohit Agarwal, a faculty in the department. I know there were some efforts made for CO2 injection in deep saline aquifers in the northwestern US. Many scientists from various departments are involved in monitoring the CO2 flow and its ability to affect surrounding rocks. What do you think, which parameter, like physical parameter like shear wave velocity, P wave velocity, or maybe density, which may play an important role for actually monitoring the injection that is being done in the aquifers?
For sure. So I think that's a great question, Mohit. I think it needs a sort of a two-pronged approach. So there are certain parameters that will give you an idea of where the mechanical deformation is happening because of the CO2, and certain parameters which will tell you where exactly the fluid is flowing to. For example, you can have changes in velocity, for example, wherever you have changes in pressure. So if you imagine you inject CO2, so the CO2 footprint is, let's say if it's restricted till here, but you can have your pressure footprint going out much further. So let's say your VP or your sort of the fluid, the velocity, the actual rock velocity measurements will give you a good idea of the pressure, and that generally gives you a good idea of where your deformation is happening. Recently, a lot of stress is being made on EM surveys, on electromagnetic measurements, which kind of give you sort of a change in resistivity with time. That's something that a couple of research groups in Stanford are working on right now, on trying to implement these systems where you get a good resistivity tomography image with time, and that also has. But I think it's in conjunction with, we need to measure the changes in velocity from the seismic, and then sort of combine that with the changes in resistivity.
Because I know there is a region known as Moxa Arch region in Western Wyoming, where they actually did some kind of injection, CO2 injections into the water aquifer. And like they also actually made a synthetic model, where synthetic physical model where they injected and then monitored. So then they did some kind of geophysical modeling and tried to find out like which parameter can play an important role. Either the shear wave velocity is getting affected in a larger extent than the VP velocity or the density. So that kind of work, I think people may be doing. The next question is asked by Rashish Chen. Hydraulic fracturing can induce stress change and reactivate dormant faults, causing earthquakes. So how we can prevent these earthquakes?
That's a $1 million question. So that's something that we have been discussing for a long time. I was a part of the Stanford Center for Induced and Triggered Seismicity. And so I guess one thing is do not inject close to a fault. That's the safest way, if we know. So essentially, if you propose a workflow, that would be to have a good idea on where the faults are through 3D seismic data, which is not often available for onshore regions because the quality is not good. So that's, if you know where the faults are, you can choose not to inject over there. If you don't know where the faults are, you're kind of going in blind. The next best thing what you can do is monitor from before. So often before these large earthquakes, you can have, when you inject fluid, often there are precursor events. So just keep monitoring, and whenever you see any, and a lot of these areas have protocols. So they have like a green light, orange light, red light. So when you have, let's say, a small earthquake of magnitude 1.5 or 2, then they look and reevaluate. Anything greater than magnitude 2.5, they stop injecting or things like that. So knowing where the faults are and then closely monitoring when you are injecting, combination of these two.
Okay, thank you. The next question is asked by Ravindra. How do you minimize the risk at the surface caused by these fractures at depth as they initiate a seismicity?
Okay. In terms of, I'm guessing this is in terms of the induced seismicity. So the best way to mitigate risk at the surface is to do the injection far away from populated areas. That's been a lesson that's learned from the example from South Korea that I showed you before. Is that it's a really bad idea to do fluid injection below an urban area or below populated area. In the US, we have, the graph I showed you, we have a large number of induced earthquakes, but they haven't caused a problem because most of these have been in rural Texas or Nevada or Wyoming, where you can have earthquakes where there are no people, but in a sense, who cares if they're not affecting people? So that's time and again. So choose the area carefully. Do not inject where you have a lot of people living or infrastructure close by.
Okay, thank you. The next question is by Dheeraj Kumar. How long we can do fracturing at a site, and what factors decides the critical limit of fracturing?
Yeah, so in terms of the hydraulic fracturing, usually in the industrial operations, one hydraulic fracturing stage is injected for about 2.5 to 3 hours. That's kind of reasonable. In terms of the critical limit, you have an estimate of how large the fractures are going to be, depending on how much fluid you inject. You have pretty good estimates on the basis of that, and you want to stay in zone. So you want to stay where the hydrocarbon is, but you don't want the fractures to go up, let's say, and connect to the aquifer where people are drinking water. So in that sense, you do a model from before, you estimate on how large the fracture is going to be. You have an idea of the stress and whether the fracture is going up or going down or going wide, and then you decide. But usually what happens in the industry these days is they pump fluid at about 80 to 90 barrels per minute, which is a really high flow rate, and for about 2.5 to 3 hours. So that's kind of a ballpark that we have.
Thank you. Another question is asked by the same person. Do we choose directional fracturing or is this random fracture?
So the direction that, okay, this is something that I did not talk a lot about in my talk, but the direction at which the fracture grows cannot be controlled by us. It is controlled by the stress. So when I spoke about, you have the two horizontal stresses, the SH min and the SH max, the fracture will go in the direction of SH max. There have been a lot of people who have proposed alternate theories that the fracture bends and all this, but whenever we have observed, it's always true. And my advisor, Professor Mark Zoback, has been pretty much shouting this for 30 years, and we now have a lot of data. What he was saying was correct, is the fracture always goes in the direction of SH min, and it's usually it's pretty planar. It's not complex or chaotic as a lot of people thought, but planar hydraulic fracture, and it goes to SH max, and there is not much we can do, but just to know where it will go. It's how the natural stress state is. Thanks for the question, Dheeraj.
Okay, thank you. There is one last question.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, not last actually. Rahul has posted it. How fractional limit of SH min is determined? Is it theoretically given value?
Yeah. Let me go back to the slide once. Okay, so for the frictional limit, we use, this is the equation that we use, and this equation is pretty well established. So what this has, you have a pore pressure and you have this term called the friction coefficient mu. The pore pressure you can measure, or you can assume hydrostatic pore pressure, which is just at the weight of the fluid column. You can locally have higher or lower pore pressures, which can make a difference. And this mu is interesting. It's usually measured in the lab, but there's a very famous geomechanics researcher by the name of John Bailey. So he has a very nice quote. He says that friction is very complicated. It does this and that, but it's always equal to 0.6. So it's, if you do not know friction, in most sedimentary rocks, it's between 0.6 to 1. And 0.6 is usually a good estimate, or you can measure it from the lab. But yeah, so if you don't know anything, then it's 0.6. And using this, if you have hydrostatic pore pressure, the SH min friction limit is approximately 0.6 times the vertical stress in these ideal conditions.
Okay, thank you. There is one last question by Partho.
Sure.
Hi Ankush, thanks for sharing your research. For geothermal field development, do you think thermal conductivity profile at depth can also be lithology driven? What are the current approaches to drive TC profile, thermal conductivity profile?
Yeah, so I am not aware of any, maybe there is, but I'm not aware of any research which has kind of related it to lithology. I know a couple of cases where they just try to do some measurements. Yeah, I'm actually not, that's a good question. Maybe there's someone trying to correlate it to lithology, but I'm not aware of that right now.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you, Ankush. We have our head of the department, Professor P.K. Khan, with us. Khan sir, do you have any question or?
No. Many thanks to Dr. Singh. It is a very nice presentation, and this is actually used for geothermal and other near surface fracturing processes. It is very helpful for modeling of geothermal conditions as well as the earthquakes and low stress drop. So this is very much important. Even also that in mining area also this is also applicable. But here one thing I am not finding here, that from this data you can draw the strength along the x-axis, that is sigma h minus sigma v, but sigma h minus sigma v versus depth not drawn or plotted. Any problem, any limitation on that aspect?
No, we can plot. Yeah, we can plot that. It's, yeah, this is just a kind of a plot representation, but you are right. We can for sure plot that as well.
Yeah, if that is plotted, then the different plots for coefficient, frictional coefficient, as well as strength of the rock, as well as depth. can be comparable through ternary plot or 3D plot. Okay, like we do in the reservoir geophysics for all these things. So that will give you, I think that will give you more innovation in that area. Got my point?
Yeah,
I am
for sure.
I am seeing that is not present here. Frictional coefficient versus strength of the rock.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, Professor Khan.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Okay, very nice presentation, very
Thank
good
you.
work. You are now PhD scholar or did already your PhD completed?
No, I finished my PhD maybe about 6 months ago, and now I'm working for a consultancy which works on geothermal and for unconventional hydrocarbon companies.
Okay, if you don't mind, may I ask one or two questions to you?
Yeah, for sure.
From which institute you passed from India or in abroad you did study your
Yeah, so
graduation?
I started out, so I did my BSc from Presidency College in Kolkata. Then I did my master's from IIT Bombay, and recently I finished my PhD
Master's in geology or geophysics?
in geology.
In geology, you did his master. You did it master.
Yeah, and then I was working for Shell for about 6 years, and then I decided to I did a bit of geophysics work, so I decided to study geophysics. Then I joined Stanford University for my
Okay, good. But you are not coming back in the academics in India.
No plans as of yet, but open in the future.
But you are very young. You are very young. If you are interested to join in Indian academics, you must prepare at your earlier stage, because in that case you will get the full professor at your younger age. Okay, this is very important. Very good work. Okay, excellent work. Many congratulations and many thanks you. Okay, again we will continue with the relationship with you. Professor Mohit will take care. And in future also, we hope more lectures for our students.
For sure.
Okay.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you. Now,
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, Ankush, it was a great presentation, and I could actually see a lot of enthusiasm within the students that they have asked a lot of good questions to you. And you have actually enlightened us with the fracture slip analysis, and also the hydraulic fracture induced seismicity and due to the injection in the subsurface. And we would like to have you back if you have any research and updates in the future. So with this, thank you so much, and we will meet again. Thank you.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you, and thanks to all the students, especially as well, for asking all the questions. And yeah, it was really great being here.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Bye.